Welcome to another disc guidance segment with the 2MK team. Specifically, we are having our last of our CE bot checkup. So we have 10 bots to go through today. Some of them are going to be shorter than others because we're just looking at bots we've seen before, or katas. So you can expect the stream to be about the same length even though there's an additional bot to look at. And we're going to be alternating again. This time we verified beforehand all of the bots we need. I'm still a little sick. I may cough, I may sniffle, I may sound nasal for the entire time. But if you're willing to put up with that, let's look at some bot updates. This is not so much a bot as our Kata 22. This is very specific training, and thankfully, is not really affected by any changes to reuse V skill or V trigger because it doesn't really use his V skill, and his V trigger is not really relevant. The general consensus among higher level players so far is that while reuse V skill 2 is good, it's again another parry. It's not the sort of thing you figure out by fighting a bot. It's not a thing that allows for you to get big setups. It's not a problem that you have to think about in terms of getting used to the match. Fully, it's you did something wrong and Ryu predicted it. This is not generally something that the bot needs to teach you how to deal with. So the fact that it doesn't have the ability at all is most likely fine. Your main goal when it comes to this kata, at least at first, is dealing with just a couple things that he does. He's basically just supposed to jump. As demonstrated with everything on, he doesn't actually use any of it regardless, so even if you do put all of them on, which you can, it just changes the way he flows. It's not going to really be a big deal. Katas are generally done such that you all have health, but right now we're just demonstrating it in the standard way. All that's really going to happen is that Ryu is eventually going to throw a fireball, and then he may or may not jump. When he throws the fireball and jumps, you're supposed to anti-air. When he throws the fireball from very close, you're supposed to punish it. Just straight up punish it. This -6. And when he throws the fireball from too far out to punish, you want to kick him. Because he's -2 basically relative to most people's normals. He's -6 if you have an 8 frame medium kick, then he's going to get hit on the second frame of your medium kick if you do it properly, which means he won't be off the ground yet, which means you get a counter hit with him grounded. This is just to explain the kata as a general thing though. It has nothing to do with his V skill, it has nothing to do with his V trigger. Nothing about Ryu has changed overall, except that in Champion Edition he has a slightly better crouch medium kick. This does matter to the flow of the bot, but only a tiny bit, as he just doesn't really use it that way. So your goal overall, play the same as always. We're also going to be showing off other stages, but that's really just because, you know, they're there. What does this mean for someone who is testing out things? If you for some reason have altered this bot to put his V skill in it for use with the full Ryu bot, let's say, it's less likely that you bothered to put it into any of the kata style inputs because most likely they were important and you understand that those are a bit stricter about what you can and cannot do. If you did change any of these inputs specifically to give it the V skill, it mostly is going to depend on where you put it. If you for some reason really want to put it somewhere, we suggest putting it in such a way that it will deal with the timing he has for the very, very occasional light uppercut he does. That's the best place to put it, basically. Anywhere else is likely to be a problem, even if you try to hide it in the Tatsu. The Tatsu is in there at a spacing and timing where it has stuff that comes after it in a very specific way, and therefore you don't end up being able to use it for the same purpose. However, having him do it as a possibility other than his reversal uppercut, like just before that, normally right now he just kind of does nothing if you manage to knock him down. If he's in the exact right timing, he might do reversal uppercut. Him doing reversal parry or reversal thrust strike isn't terrible, so it's probably fine. Therefore, we can easily move on right away. Our next look will be at Lara, and we have shown off our Lara bot 1.4 already actually in the stream, but Lara bot 1.0 is a little simpler and uses the V skill a lot more, because V skill is one of the things you need to get used to first against Lara, basically. Of course, this situation generally means that you have to think too much about what exactly she wants to do in matchups. If based on what our Lara player has decided, you're not going to see this V skill a lot unless you play zony matchups or ones where your main ways of striking at her involve waiting for her to make a move and then trying to like hit a spot. Her being able to make a move into the air that comes down quickly and isn't a full jump can be useful. However, your goals against Lara don't really change here. Even though you're technically dealing with the V skill, most of the point of Lara bot is to get your meaties correct and to avoid certain things she does. One thing you do want to understand though, and that you can absolutely use this bot to understand in this form, is exactly how her V skill works and how punishable it is at certain ranges. Generally, she should mostly use it at ranges where it's easy to do. Understand, that is. With her rhythm, generally you won't expect her to be doing the move from too close for no reason. She should mostly be playing close range footsies, trying to get a grab on you, and when she does do it, you'll get that often. In Lara bot 1.4, you're much less likely to get the jump into clap version. Well, the spring into clap version. She also gets the empty version in this version, which has a big effect on whether or not you do things, because sometimes the opponent doesn't want to do that, they want to try to basically empty jump it and see if they can get away with it, whereas you have to worry about stuff like that. It's just not easy to tell because Lara chooses what to do with this move relatively late into it compared to many other characters. And she has a jump that works quite well for cross-ups and similar to put her in similar spaces, but she's not necessarily that hard to anti-air, even when she's using it. The main problem you might have is that if she does do the clap timing and your anti-air button doesn't reach as far as you'd like, it can be difficult. Uppercuts require much faster reactions, and if she does the hop into clap from close enough, it can actually be relatively hard to anti-air even with quick pokey buttons because it's functionally a special. She does react as if she's doing a special when you hit her, meaning that she gets to do her stuff either way. In fact, part of the reason we choose Chun-Li for this is that fact that she's basically barely that sort of character that has to care. Because she has to care so much about the anti-airs, adding one more layer of something to do and think about can be at least meaningful. And because Chun-Li wants to play footsies, and this is Lara's new way of bypassing footsies, it's beneficial to her. But even then, she's mostly for meaty practice. What you can use it for though, very often, is using the same principle. You are getting to test your meaties on something that's similar to an air reset. which means that you get to treat her as an air reset bot more than you did before. Or use your air-to-air moves to check what they're going to get. You can use more often, you get the proper knockdowns from those, and figure out, hey, does this meaty work correctly? Making her overall better at helping you deal with obscure things like knockdowns off of things that are sometimes air resets and technically sometimes not. And she is built as a whole to focus around making sure she has different rise timings. Lots of them. Overall, she hasn't become any harder or easier to stop, as a whole. She's just that you can use this to get used to the move. If you didn't feel confident in all of the options before, since we've never actually made our Larabot 1.4 public due to various issues with its implementation, or rather, with the craziness required to input it for certain people. Instead, you probably have this version. The sort of person that has Larabot 1.4 is the sort of person who watches very specific streams. She's also very likely to be useful regardless of how specifically well you manage the input. She also works decently with even partial inputs. Because as we've mentioned, we did do some changes to give her a slightly different action 5, which is a little bit more common. In fact, let's take a look at that now. Larabot's action 5 in general isn't this, but you've already seen the version where this is related. And remember that sometimes we have these reversed, but just to verify that we do not, here you go. So this is neither of those things. We have work done with our Larabot all across different versions of the game. Different changes are done on different systems, but we are aware that mostly what will happen if you don't have it is that she'll do slightly less of the V skill. And you can feel free to use this version. It's hard to time, but not specifically that hard to do. And just to show it off again, in case you are one of those people that gets your bots from streams. This is a medium kick, followed by a V trigger, followed by a V skill, and 2 more medium kick hits. But again, we're not going to go into too heavy detail on the Lara business because it's really not that big a change. You get to do more things, but the purpose of the bot remains mostly unchanged. I didn't even bother to change like the meters or anything. What we want to talk about is characters with more of an input in it. We have looked at Ed before. And we have 2 very slightly different versions of Ed. One that is designed to be used with his V-Trigger 2, and one that is designed to be used with his V-Trigger 1. We've already looked at the one designed to be used for V-Trigger 2 because that was just the Ed bot we happened to have available to us on that particular stream. And now, therefore, we will look at the one that is designed to be used with V-Trigger 1.
Instant kill.
This Edbot has a purpose more suited for the same sort of things as Ryubot, but you get to learn a little bit about footsies while you're doing it, some of the time. It depends on your character quite heavily, honestly. His gauges are auto-recover on all fronts, which can be a little bit overwhelming at first, but it's not usually so bad. The main thing you're learning... Oh wait, we did do that wrong. We trigger one. It must have hit both. Okay, so, in general, Edbot is meant to help you deal with closing in, learning to dash throw people. You can also use it for the secondary purpose of learning a very specific type of footsies on footsies heavy characters. It does not work on just learning to play footsies as a general thing because your character's footsie tools might not be within the same ranges. But Karin, Chun-Li, to some extent Ryu and Ken, Sakura, those types of characters spend a lot of time hitting their stand medium kick or other long mid buttons in neutral as their primary tactics. And Ed is good at making this slightly strange because of when he chooses to do certain things. You will end up getting whiff punish for just sticking out the buttons. So if you hit too many buttons just to hold your opponent quiet, it's a little bit easier to train against Ed than against, say, Urien, because Urien is a matter of waiting a ton until Urien does exactly the right thing and fixing your spacing. Ed is about fixing your timing. And also, anti-airing him is important because he doesn't really jump that often. Air to airing him is even harder. He does jump, but you do have to focus enough on other things, specifically your own forward dash timing, meant usually to be a punish for something that he did or a spacing that he left open, that whether or not you are likely to actually catch this jump is a focus related thing. In this version you also have to deal with his sweep, which is just pain, but the real question here is, of course, how much does this V-skill 2 affect the whole thing? Well, Ed is not really meant to use his V-skill a lot, and it tends to be hidden in the V-trigger, which he can just use basically forever. But it is still in there, especially when he's doing certain things in neutral. Something will eat the V-trigger input as it's fairly early in, and the V-skill input is toward the end of it, meaning that he does get the sway. Which sway Ed uses depends on how you input the thing. The down V-skill is kind of an uppercutty thing. This part isn't really as important to the bot in either form. If you decided you wanted to work on either version, you could absolutely change it around so he used both, so that he did whatever you needed him to do. Even when he is using his other V-trigger, he's normally fine even if you do this. It leaves a little bit more spaces open, and we've suggested, well, hey, depending on which character type you use, whether or not you're more likely to try to approach Ed by jumping or some aerial technique, or try to get in on Ed through grounded movement, that's how you decide whether or not to have Ed do his standing V-skill or his crouching V-skill, which would target his snatcher upward. In this case, it's the same thing really. The crouching V-skill does an uppercut style move that, while not as good as snatcher, depending on your character, once again, it can actually do some damage and throw off your rhythm. And similarly, if you tend to approach from the ground a lot, him having the ability to do the sway part of this to go forward, especially because it does in fact avoid moves and mess with your footsies, can equally end up being important. The main issue with the Edbot is that unless you tend to poke at him from really far away, he doesn't tend to sway through much. You have to poke him and interrupt him because of the natural rhythm of other things he has. He tends to use it as a recovery, meaning that if you're playing standard slower footsies where you're only really trying to poke him with one button at a time, you're less likely to deal with this. However, since that was often the timing that we were expecting to be able to use to dash up, some characters may still be affected. And if you have a tendency to play footsies by clipping Ed's feet, you're more likely to run into this as a thing that affects you. This is also at least somewhat shifted by how much your Edbot actually achieves the whole dash up thing. Because not all Edbots really do the dash up input that well or that often. We've probably tried to demonstrate on stream before that sometimes you just want to re-input that whole thing every now and again just to change the dash timing on Ed. But this is unlikely to change much about when he uses the sway aspect of it or what he gets out of it. Getting the timing correct or correct enough is difficult, but this is not related to the same timing at all, and you generally shouldn't have to worry about how he's affected overall by it. There should be very few situations in which he's going to dash at you and then end up trying to do the Psycho Sway after. The timings just don't usually line up for that. As Kansuki demonstrates, you can also use it to tell whether or not you should deal with certain of Ed's moves in certain ways, and it can therefore let you learn that same sort of thing for the sway. But as for how much the bot is affected by the sway being in it, he's not going to spam it. He's not going to be too much of a problem with it. He uses it just enough for you to get used to it a little bit, maybe learn how to deal with which buttons to use after he does it in block, whether or not you can expect it and like clip his feet on his way in. Generally you shouldn't be able to do this, but you can learn exactly how long you have before he becomes invulnerable to certain strikes and so on. If you have tendencies to throw projectiles after managing to clip the opponent, different things will happen, and so on. So take your time and learn what you can from it. Don't expect it to be overwhelming or become a heavy focus in the bot just as the old one wasn't. You're a lot more likely to just get to learn when to punish it. Well, punish it, and how to otherwise deal with it. It does somewhat lessen your chances to actually do the point system for the bot because it takes up some animations and puts him in spaces that you don't really get the point anymore. But he does backdash still. He probably, in most builds, backdashes enough that it's still fine. And you'll still get to learn all of the interactions required, while struggling to deal with him at those few times he does jump. Let's move on therefore. As we mentioned, depending on your inputs of Zangief, he is slightly different. You can learn the same things from the Zangief bot in all cases, but this is the sort of nuance we're talking about. Certain characters get more out of certain things when facing him, and in this case, we're going to end up looking at something different altogether. Let's go to the underground arena as always. Generally, Zangief was also designed almost entirely around learning to get around the cycle lariat. We did test a while back that he sort of works with his V trigger too, but it doesn't really teach you anything about that, as that is not a thing you can learn to deal with or get out of. He either grabs you or he doesn't, and then you die or you don't. Should be all on. Yeah, okay, here we go. So that's the first obvious point. Jump in response to running bear grab. Someone who's practiced a lot at this has no problems with this aspect of Zangief bot. Reversal of his V trigger, also almost certainly fine. Learning to dash in to punish after he whiffs his heavy punch, or sweep punishing it, is a little harder. In certain cases you have entirely different methods of doing the whole thing. But, there you go. Depending on your input of Zangief bot, he's going to get a lot more mileage out of that kick. Mostly based entirely on you doing the right thing on Wake Up, he's going to end up doing it. It's still going to be a rare enough move that you're not going to know when he's going to use it. He shouldn't spam it. In fact, it's one of those situations once again where the better you get at the bot, the more likely you are to see it. So I'm going to do that ridiculous thing where I work on my instant head stomp with punish of his punch. Because that's actually a fairly easy way to get it to happen. Even though, don't count on me getting it done that much. If you poke him in neutral, you will often get more responses around the move. But it is a relatively rare thing and mostly happens out of either blocking or a very specific hidden timing. You'll notice that, for example, unless you poke Zangief a lot, he actually doesn't do too much either. I've gotten so used to literally dashing in under his hand now. You can most easily see this from the corner because all of his ranges are very precise at that point. But as you can see, not a popular move, not going to be overwhelming you with how often he uses it, which is probably good because it's not that useful. For most scenarios he cares about anyway. In terms of using it for the kata, it's actually much harder. So we may at some point start discussing what happens in the related kata. It was not really worth the time to do for Lara. But for Zangief, there is definitely a point in the kata where this starts to make a difference. The kata for Zangief is basically about figuring out what Zangief does. You get in, you hit like medium punch or something, you dash back out, and you hope for the best. Basically you dash in, hit medium punch, sometimes he'll block, and your job is to get back away from it. In fact, honestly, depending on how well you've done it, a lot of the time he will block. And you can even use this to train your, like, various concepts of hit confirms off your stand medium much. Because if you do get it right, yes, you are advantaged by Zangief. You don't want to be that close, even if you're advantaged, because you can't just go for throw. You might have your opponent guess and beat you out entirely. So that was bad on my part, for example. As was that, but technically this is okay. But for whatever reason, probably because that's just the fortune of his flow, if you do the kata part better, he tends to end up doing the move more. Possibly because of how it's tied into his other movements in neutral. The idea being that for you to dash upon him and force him to block, or even hit him, changes his timing in such a way that he's more likely to do something. The kata therefore changes a ton of things he does, and depending on how you overdo it, or just happen to like block some of his moves, you may find yourself blocking, thinking it's your turn to come in, and then that happening. You'll also notice that if you're doing the kata version, he spends a lot less time doing the money bear grab, which is partially why we developed this purpose for it. So, users of Kata 31, be aware that this is going to change things a lot more. Because before, he would just like flex out in the middle of nowhere and do nothing to you, because if you were doing it even remotely correctly, you should have jumped away by then. Or ran away. Backdashed. Overall, you can change the bot's entire rhythm by making this one of your goals. If you stand too far out and don't actually dash in, he'll act as normal as he did before. And if you make an effort to make that dash in thing work, different things will happen. But as the move is not all that meaningful, it doesn't have a lot of specifics it causes in the matchup or in the kata or the bot. It's not really something to spend a lot of time learning about. He just does it sometimes, and that's about all you need to know. So we can move on once more. Our Juri bot is generally about practicing your meaties again, and we're going to talk about her more so than most of the bots you're going to see today. And we're also going to use her on her V trigger too as well, because it does have a very slight effect on this as a whole. This move isn't great for helping her avoid anything relative to meaties, but honestly neither is the other, so it doesn't matter too much here. Technically, if your knockdowns or meaties relied on meter, you got more out of this the other way. But for her meters, we're going to change her to auto recover on both. And we move on. She's a relatively easy bot to do damage to. It's really not the point. The point is that once you've done that damage, you need to test your meaties. She's particularly helpful with this because she has so many different ways of getting out of all sorts of meaties. She does have at least one jump, even though she won't use it often. Even if you did like meaty fireball, she'll sometimes read Ansatsu through that, etc. Her V skill, however, barely changes what she's doing, other than to make it so that she doesn't spend a lot of time in neutral getting to you. Once you've learned to counter that move, you don't really care as much, and the same thing applies here. Once you've learned to counter her new projectile, I guess you can still have to call it that. So let's have Katsuki Dynasty focus specifically on the meaty part while I explain more aspects of this. Juri having this move available gives her one small thing to do in neutral that puts some space in front of her. If you cannot respond to her doing this very quickly, this tends to be a problem. You can treat this as a challenge in simply that you can, in fact, go ahead and use the fact that she tried to do this move as another chance to knock her down, because most of your knockdowns from her are currently such that they come off your big crush counters, you come off your understanding of one big thing in neutral, or making a specific type of punish, occasionally an anti-air. It's just designed that way. You are supposed to be able to go for big damage, to have little or no worry about which exact damage you did, meaning that yeah, you don't have to crouch counter her every time, you could use any combo you liked. But eventually what's going to happen is that she will do something else. She will poke out in neutral, and she's not an easy character to easily hit in neutral. Even as it is now. You could get knockdowns with like EX fireballs and stuff, but those don't really lead to knockdowns often enough that you'd really want to try. She does provide you with a lot of things to V-reversal though. And, depending on, as it says in our page, character preference comes up here. Does your character get anything off their V-reversal or not? If they do, feel free to do this, because you will eventually get practice on the V-reversal when she does her super. She's also, like Lara, designed to not necessarily wake up the same way every time, meaning you have to work on it regardless of what you do. Generally though, this move isn't going to be a big threat. She almost always does something else right afterwards. And it does take a while for her to build it up, so it's not an issue. She does have the capacity, as just shown there, to jump directly after using it in most inputs of her. And because of the way she was input relative to the V skill to begin with, she will specifically like sometimes hold it and sometimes like... She does different things because she has the capacity to do different things, just as she used to have the capacity in V-Trigger 1 to specifically hold the V skill for longer, backdash out of it, etc. But you should treat her trying to charge it as an opportunity to poke her in neutral. Or maybe to hit her with a special, it doesn't even matter. Whereas normally, you mostly left her alone Now you have a moment where you can hit her, and you can see what you can get off of knockdowns that are a little sparser in terms of rewards. As with all bots, there is a benefit to the fact that she's built this way. In short, you have to try to get meaties, and meaties are almost always fully random. Since she has an invincible makeup, if you go for a meaty every time, you're going to get hit at least a third of the time. She doesn't do a ton of damage with her EX uppercut, but it's there, and it is a problem enough that you're going to eventually get beat up. This means that a lot of the time, if you don't focus on this enough to poke her and get your knockdowns within a certain amount of time, let's say, between that and the chip damage, you're going to fall before you can get your points. So even if it seems easy at the beginning, and you'd think, well, why would I bother spending time hitting her while she's doing this? At least from the bot perspective, you have a reason. Especially if you didn't set your own V meter to full. She builds up a lot of V meter on most of us, and if we crush counter, you generally have enough V meter to pay for everything, in terms of getting out of her super. But waiting for her to do the full thing, that specifically, rewards you with V meter, but also rewards her with chip damage. And given that her point system D is really hard, specifically that you should knock her out of Ryodanzatsu. Nearly everyone can knock her out of Ryodanzatsu, but there's not a reaction most people are likely to have. Even when you know it's coming, this is not a move most people can like counter on reaction. However, it is meant to teach you that she has what we like to call light hitboxes, as in they normally are not ahead of her hurtboxes and tend to lose out to simple things like your character doing like jab or something. There's a lot of nuances to Juri that you have to understand, which we won't go into here. Mostly related to exactly how much time you have to do specific things. But because of the timing of the skill part, when she does throw out the V skill 2, you can almost always block. If you just didn't feel like doing anything related to setups or mix-ups that day, the V skill 2 is not going to interrupt your play style. She will most of the time just do EX Fuha right after it. Sometimes she'll jump. And a couple of the times she does have some other options, but you're not likely to see them too much. Just bear it in mind when you're practicing your knockdowns that you have to deal with all this repeatedly. This is also meant more so to get you used to the psychological part of it. You can't get discouraged from doing your pressure because you can be hit. When you want to do your pressure, you have to choose to do it, just because you feel it's time. And even though in this case that usually means, oh, against Juri bot you basically do it every time, it's more so to teach you, oh, I got hit. I should not consider this to mean anything because my opponent just woke up with something. Maybe there are certain times where you should think, oh, they have full meter, I shouldn't do this. But we don't necessarily suggest changing her meters in order to make this work because it tends to disable a lot of the things she needs to do. without making her any more effective at her job, really. Landing your meaties is a big deal. And she should be along the Laura level of just competent and effective enough that if you do the meaty off in some way, timing-wise, or spacing-wise, or misread which wake-up she uses, that will happen. But as for the V skill 2, it's not likely to interrupt you terribly. If anything, it will just give you another way to look at the matchup and go, okay, well, what if the only hit I can land in a matchup is one quick crouch medium into something small? How can I practice that meaty and practice recognizing and practice planning the fact that I need to use that one? This is helpful in that way. But we can move on. As noted, she was going to be the longer one. But we don't want to spend too long. This brings us to R.Mika bot, the original version. We've attempted to input Mika bot on other systems. It sort of works, but they tend to be slightly watered down versions of the true being.
Ring of power. Chun-Li. R.Mika.
We may change this one based on whether or not we're talking about the kata or the bot. Mika bot is a little different than most in that she is one of those bots that gets points. But fortunately, the timing that Mika bot gets points is really easy to understand compared to some of our other bots that get points from stuff they do. Hers is really easy to understand. All gauges to normal. So let's continue. Mika gets a point when you hit her armor, but don't hit her. Now in this version, therefore, obviously, we're not dealing with armor anymore. This sort of means that you don't really need to give Mika points anymore either. But because of the way the V skill gets used, and the timing, it's more likely that you're not going to have this happen at all. So we've lessened the chance of the bot getting any points and managing to beat you that way, and somewhat lowered how dangerous she is, because normally she would hold on to the mic and possibly hold on to it for a long time, and you'd mess up somewhere in there. Now, the timings for her using the move, particularly in her regular flow, are much smaller. In short, the V trigger on Mika has shifted such that the old things you were getting used to, hitting her before she kept on doing mic for too long, stopped being effective. Now you have to worry mostly about her literally parrying you like that. The timing for that move is such that you will most often see it when she has already set up something else that you are desperately trying to mash out of. This was always intended because at least the only time you'd really get to see her armor do its full job is in a similar situation. She's doing something because you were trying to do something to get out of whatever it was she was doing. It was a good way to lower the amount of damage overall that she did without forcing you to deal with all of her mix-ups all of the time. But because of the spacing of the move in her moveset, it's a lot more likely that you're only going to see it if you aren't that practiced and are more likely to mess up your own wake-ups or combos or something. On the other hand, it removes the whole I can just use multi-hit moves and it will deal with my Mika problems. The character is good enough at footsies that you don't really have to worry that much about it. Which brings us to the aspect related to the kata. For the kata, the gauges stay the same, but the player gets theirs. This is mainly because of the strict requirements of it. Normally I would again turn on health because the kata basically requires you to do things on your own wake up after being knocked down. But for now it's probably fine. We're just repeating the situation anyway. Your basic goal is the same overall. You get knocked down, you backdash, you wait to see what Mika does, and then you hit her. Most of the time, though, you have a different stressor. Can you actually land any punish from there? In the kata version, you can just flat out let her knock you down, but I have to be a little bit more careful about this. So you wake up backdash, and then you watch her and see what she does. You have two options basically. If she does knock you down, and you backdash on your wake up, and she doesn't approach you, then you have to go back in. And you have to figure out whether or not you have enough time to do that. And much like Zangief, getting better at this whole thing leads to the same sort of situation. She will use the move more as you play out the whole kata. Fortunately, a lot of the time she's going to come toward you, which removes a lot of the problem. So you shouldn't have to worry too much there. This is one of the characters where you can't really do the bot thing and the kata thing at the same time. Unlike Zangief where you can at least sort of. So I'm not going to try to demonstrate one or the other too much. Sorry, them at the same time too much. The main idea here is that Mika moves forward enough that you have to care. And she plays footsies in interesting enough ways that you have other problems. Simply mashing buttons is not likely to get you very far. And recognizing when she's in the wrong position and you're going to miss something, or when you have to go back in, is a big deal. Before, this was a bigger deal because sometimes, just sometimes, after her getting her knockdown, she would then use the mic, like there, and build up more meter, and you'd have to decide, do I have enough time to get back in? Do I have enough time? Is she holding it? What's going on here? Now, usually, depending on how you do your wake up, it's not going to come up at all. This is harder for me to demonstrate because I have an extreme tendency to wake up backward all of the time. It's such a lead thing. You spend more time on the ground, you get more time to charge things. Opponent has to come farther, blah blah blah. But the overall idea remains the same. She moves herself forward very slightly with most of her actions, and you have to decide which thing you do is most important. while not getting in some way countered, parried, or hit by a chair. The overall shifts to the game from her perspective are not really there. There's nothing different about what Mika does as a result of having this be skill overall. It's a little better in pressure matches and a little worse in zoning matches, and that's all you really care about. When you do get cornered, there is a bigger effect on it if you're the type that gets really flustered and mashes out in corner a lot. But depending on how well you play against this bot, or even against the kata, you're not as likely to get cornered as you might think. Especially if you've been training against the bot for a while, because that's kind of the plan, to not get cornered. Therefore we can move on. There's not much more to say. Now that we've gone from dealing with punishes, back dashes, hit confirms, there is kind of like an advanced level of this, and the advanced level of this is generally Cody bot.
Jolly feet down. Harin Kanzuki. Cody.
Okay, come on.
I think this Cody bot is built for Dirty Coach. We do have variations on Cody bot, depending on which V trigger you want to use. At the moment I don't actually remember which it is, but you can tell pretty quickly, so I'll just switch it if it's wrong. Now, since the almost entirely Cody bot's main point system is based on understanding the ranges you can punish his V skill, which is before his invincible move. Now, there's a little difference, obviously. And in his case, he needs some... his gauges are normal, and the player doesn't really matter too much. You can set them to wherever you want. Mostly it has to do with learning what you want to learn in the specific situation. However, since your main ideas here are you need to deal with his throws and similar, and throw him after his Zonk Knuckle, there is some focus changes that happen because he now does the sway instead of the double kick. Sway helps learn things against his footsies, but it also brings him closer to you constantly in a way that the kick didn't. The kick was just, oh, he did something that I could have punished, but I wasn't aware enough. Now it is, he did something and moved closer to me as a result of doing this thing. He does have the zoning jump and some other jump shenanigans. But let's continue to focus primarily on the punishes and take throw aspects of them. Let's see, this looks about right for... yep, okay. This is the one that is, in fact, primed to use Dirty Coach correctly. Now, before he would do things like dash up and use his V skill, which was a big deal if you were the sort of person who reacted to dashes too fast. Or rather, too slow, in the sense that he could dash, your reaction would be slow, and then he would have an invincible move in that space of time. Now he still has an invincible move, so that part has not changed about the bot. If he dashes up to you and you try to check him with a button, he still has the capacity to get through this button. What he does not have is a really punishable moment right afterward. But since he doesn't actually spam this move that much, he also doesn't spend too much time getting in as a whole, more than you would want him to. In the other form of him, he might do it a bit more. So if you have the version that is intended to use the knife more, or use more ruffian kicks, it may matter more. We can't speak entirely about Cody bot because we tend to do our Cody bot testing like at tournaments and so on, where he's just available and we see what happens if we try to input him different ways. So we are going to have to do more extensive work to figure out whether or not any of the other forms of Cody bot are terribly affected by this. And since you generally shouldn't let Cody just dash up to you, you still somewhat have to deal with that aspect of it. In this case, we're using one of our quote-unquote high mobility characters, so the VT2 is a good matchup fit here. You can see that he spends a lot of time being frustrating and annoying with the rock and pipe. And the spacing that he ends up at is good, so you do get to see this in the way it should naturally appear. In other words, this is what you should be seeing. If you play the sort of character that matches Kareen, the very in and out style of play, Nash, Ed, Kareen can be played this way. Doesn't have to be. She does have the other form, but she can be played this way. And generally doesn't tend to be played as pure rushdown because she doesn't benefit as much. This is approximately the rhythm you should expect, and therefore around the amount of times he will use this way. If you poke at him more, he tends to use it more. But poking at him more isn't really part of Cody's design as a character overall. Your main focus needs to be dealing with all this while still anti-airing, which is a challenge unto itself. The fact that this is in fact cancelable into his V-trigger stuff does change some things though. And you will end up needing to learn that, and this is a good way to learn it. It actually doesn't require you to be using V-trigger 2, it will work either way. It's just that he'll burn through his V-trigger 1 faster. You'll still get to learn in a long session approximately the same number of things. So if you are a VT1 Cody bot user, don't worry too much about it, just put in a little extra time rather than just like fighting him when you occasionally fight a Cody in ranked or something. Since he's not a character that most people need to deal with unless they have tick throws that they need to perfect, like Kage for example, it's not a bot we expect to see a lot of people using, but with Champion Edition now making a lot more characters available to people and therefore a lot more bots, you should probably still take a look at him at some point. Another good thing this helps with though is to recognize that if Cody is managing to make you block dash up Crime's way, it means you're letting Cody dash at you. Which you might want to focus on as a thing eventually. He's not the best bot to train it on though, that's what Sakura is for. It's easier to get used to the idea without having to deal with Cody's complex concept of neutral. Once you're used to Sakura, maybe then Cody will help. The stage is growing on me a little bit. Not something I want to see in background in a lot of tournaments, but you know, a little bit. Moving on though. A character where we're not going to go into lots of detail is G. Now, we could go into lots of detail of explaining what G's V skill 2 does, but it's best to learn that sort of thing from a reference that you can keep on re-referencing when you need to. Sure, there are a lot of gold people in this stage. Let's do that. No. Let's go this way. He looked good in his tracksuit, I think. Yes, he did.
I am the world president.
Generally, it didn't matter whether or not you use V trigger 1 or 2 for our G-bot, but V trigger 1 is slightly better. We find V trigger 2 less helpful. You can use both for sure, but we didn't put as much effort into getting the rhythm right for the V trigger 2 because it's not really the sort of thing that gets used in that way by most people. He does not get meters either. The player, however, does get theirs because you need it for a lot of things. Now, overall, the parts of this that you care about for bot work are the fact that every time G uses G protection, it prevents a 1 loss of President power. Now, G isn't built to use his V skill that often. G-bot uses his V skill mostly in weird cancels like that, and the fact that he can now use it in cancels is a big deal. But every time you see that big flash when you hit him, it means that you have hit the protection and not the actual V skill. Here it doesn't matter because now he's in actual V trigger, so it doesn't matter at all. Now, you can learn all of the complex aspects of how this works precisely. Note that if he doesn't have any presidentiality, it makes no difference. So you kind of care only when he does get it. He can build up protections without having presidentiality. But he still has to try to get the presidentiality sometime. In V-Trigger, you have to worry about the fact that this move, the V skill, gets some armor. It's not usually useful armor though. Given the rhythm of the bot, and just actually in the game, the armor is not that helpful. It helps you when you thought you could get away with it and your opponent's move is only likely to hit once and not be a big deal. Now, his defense goes up when you get this move. Again, if you're familiar, Street Fighter 3, those sorts of things. It's relevant. But because of the timings of it, it also prevents him from getting presidentiality as often, just by the nature of the flow. This is fine overall for the bot though, because he actually... that's basically the first point system you lose. You get points for taking away G's presidentiality, but as with most of our point systems, that's basically the first thing he stops. You stop getting points for. Whether or not this is great is hard to say. You just have to think about it in the overall flow of the game though. Because you still wouldn't want him building up much defense, right? So you still have to consider how this should work. As for the rest of how he generally works, the original V skill wasn't really part of the point system, as in it didn't matter whether or not you knew how to deal with that move. Some characters dealt with it better than others, so it wasn't really an important aspect of his game plan. Or rather, counter game plan. What this does, therefore, is change something else. It also very slightly increases the chances that you will be able to get point system D points. Specifically because he will not have presidentiality in the first place to use. But now that he's built up a little bit, I guess out of luck and help demonstrating things, let's see what happens. So he now has both G protection and presidentiality up. At least I think he has protection. It works different ways. You have to, as again, you should just look it up yourself most of the time. But he's technically at 1, I believe, because normally the other one glows a little bit more. But notice, no presidentiality loss. And now he's gone. Basically, this makes this match into more of a what's his status right now situation. And you can use it as test of your tracking ability, honestly. Because there's quite a bit to track. His opportunities to build this up come up often enough, even in the flow of the bot, that you have to care. And it's actually not that easy a move to punish, because normally if you're playing against G and he's keeping you at the correct range, unless you're like Dalsim or Chun-Li, he just kinda gets to do this for free. Sagat might be able to reach as a general regular thing. Reaching isn't in itself the difficulty, it's more so that can your character do the move in time that he won't actually get the buff. Overall flow though, mostly unaffected, and since you can end up hitting armor, you do have the option of confirming certain moves. You can make that whole thing unto itself. It's actually kind of useful. But this is again only in his V trigger state, so even more to learn and think about. That's probably all we need to specifically say in this case though. we are moving on to Lucia. Lucia is a lot about frame data. When I say a lot, I mean a lot about frame data. This is probably the most annoying place to put her. If you don't understand much frame data, this character will eventually overwhelm you in some way.
Lucia.
Start in, I'll take you downtown.
If you're going to be using her V trigger, so her V skill too, you generally want to use it with her V trigger too. It's not required, but you will get some of it, some more benefit from it. Her gauges are going to be maximum start, more so for a rhythm reason. But your own don't really need to be all that different. You can pick whatever you want. In this case, we'll leave it as double normal and move on. Technically, there's no need for changing relative to Lucia Bot at all. Before, she had a relatively simple V skill where the spacing mattered, and now she has a sort of complex V skill where the timing matters. But the actual point system doesn't need to change. You still aim for a punish on the V skill. In fact, you can immediately see how learning to distinguish that move from other moves and try to punish it is going to be one of the main things you're going to need to do against Lucia. Because I'm sure that people are going to be very happy with their new, oh, I get to bypass footsies again. As she would say, she's all in. Now obviously you can punish this move, or quote-unquote punish this move with throw, but you're probably eventually going to want something more, so work on that, whatever it is you prefer. She can still benefit from doing the move from the correct range, and the move is altered when she is in V skill, sorry, when she's in V trigger 1, but that's kind of why we don't actually suggest doing it. You first would need to learn to punish it when she's not in V trigger, and recognize all the parts of it. Because every time you see a new move, you have to get used to the idea that this move's block stun ends at this point and it's my turn to do something. Learning the reversal timing on new moves is always important, but in Lucia's case specifically, it comes up a lot because she's one of those characters who gets to use moves in very specific timings, with the full intention of messing with your punish timing. If you are not the type who is really comfortable with your punish timings, or whose moves are tough enough to time the cancels for that you don't have the focus to do both things, she's a good bot to train against, which is why she became effectively our most advanced bot. Being able to deal with Lucia bot well is the difference between understanding how to play Street Fighter and actually being good at playing Street Fighter. And you're just gonna have to accept or get used to at some point the fact that, yeah, she actually tests something about you that is beyond your knowledge. Most of our bots test primarily knowledge. The advanced ones tend to test reactions. Lucia tests both, constantly. And again, it comes down to understanding things like frame data, so we could go into full detail about how you will know whether or not you actually punished her, or if she was just happened to not be blocking. How you can know which moves actually had the problem when you happen to get hit at long range and she's maybe one more frame into her move and therefore slightly less minus. If you didn't know what any of that meant, this is probably not the bot for you. But if you are familiar, you can use this bot as you always did. She has one more move that you have to understand the property of, and you can move on from there. What we did note is that this causes her to jump slightly less. Not a lot less, but enough less for some reason, probably because of the animation length, that it once again changes the punishing sliding attacks thing. Note that when we say punish one of Lucia's sliding attacks, because we realized it wasn't always completely clear on the bot page, we did in fact also mean just her sweep. Because she barely ever uses the other one, but yes, it is valid to just punish Lucia sweep. You have enough other Lucia things to think about that punishing Lucia sweep is a big enough challenge you have to care. And because it's the same thing, you have to get used to the idea that she can barely change the frame data of this, and it affects what you can do in response. As just demonstrated though, she did show off that she does have both versions of the V-skill thing. Specifically, she can do the V-skill out of the rough chase, and it does a different move. Depending on your input of Lucia, we're not always sure she will have this ability. But she should. If you find that yours doesn't, we're still working on exactly what you need to fix. We'll try to update the bot page at some point if you realize yours never ever does it. But please note it might just be incredibly rare, because rough chase itself, by most inputs, is also going to be incredibly rare. If yours doesn't generally do the version of it where she stops short, because you can put that in, but we don't necessarily suggest doing it early. If she doesn't do that at all, then you're likely to see it, and if she does, maybe that's the reason you're never seeing the skill version of it. But please feel free to let us know, because we are still looking into this, and most people didn't buy Lucia. So until we all have Champion Edition and are all checking our various inputs of Lucia bot, because we will all have to input it separately and verify that it looks the same or different, we won't have as much data as just people using them can provide. So please let us know through our website. We'll continue with her a little bit longer because she does have a couple more things to point out. So let's change her to V trigger 1, and while we do that, we'll get the idea of the last two bots we need to show off. The claw bot that we thought was available on the last stream is going to be one, and our Guile bot is the other. When it comes to Guile bot, we have a specific thing we wanted to get done, but we're not sure it's going to happen because of the way we set up the streams. We do have two Guile bots, and one of them is almost entirely about learning to deal with his V-Trigger 1 for characters that have problems with his V-Trigger 1. Therefore, we didn't really figure there was much reason to do that. He's set up to do it at timings where it wouldn't help much, and the response is entirely different. In short, our Guile bot 1 doesn't work with his V-Skill 2 because it's just not designed to do that. It's designed to work almost entirely around his V-Skill 1. You can learn to do things with it, but it's not really a high level of effect you get out of learning it, and you generally don't get much out of the bot. Which is kind of a shame because he does it more often than Guilebot 2, by far, but his move isn't something you really want to see that often. And Claw we've already shown off in similar ways, the Matador effect. But he tended to almost always do the move right away. And we were fairly sure that we have a Claw bot where he doesn't just do the move right away. Where you actually have to think about whether or not it's coming, when it's coming, and other things he could do with timing. Well, we do in fact have that Clawbot. And that's what is coming up next. As for Lucia, as you can see, when you do get hit by this, with it enhanced by her V trigger one, it knocks down. Basically, anything else, again, if you don't understand frame data, nothing I say is going to help. And if you do understand it, you've probably already checked it. Especially if you're the sort of person who went into testing your Lucia bot to find out if there was a change, you probably have already finished anything I'm going to say. So, overall, that's how that works. She's going to be able to do more moves. Some of them are going to be surprising. You're definitely going to have to deal with them a lot more. She loses a bit of her combo potential, not a lot. But most importantly, that V skill gets those properties without specifically depleting the gauge. Which is what's going to make it important. The only reason we don't consider this the primary thing you should train therefore is because V-trigger is still V-trigger. It takes a while to get it. She can't just randomly do V-trigger things. And it's exactly the sort of move where if she hits you with it, it's causing a knockdown. You don't get any more options. You either blocked or you didn't. And as mentioned, in general, when bots are like that, we don't really spend a lot of time on dealing with that sort of binary situation in terms of your training. We're sure that people who do these things can do that on their own. Meaning we get to move on for today. So we are going to look at Claw first, briefly. We need to look at him exactly long enough to display the differences in timing. And then Guile will get a little more time, and that's it, actually. That will have covered all of the bots. Since technically Guile already got looked at in both cases. And let's just straight up give him Flamenco Tavern. As we've already discussed, he doesn't have a version that makes use of the other methodology for him. He doesn't have one that makes use of the Sky High Claw that he got back. And technically he doesn't have one that climbs the cage. We were eventually going to make one that did. But in this case, let's go with this. Now we have a second reason to do this, because now we have a way to do it that will also probably let him do the cage climb. This is not really meaningful though, because if you're really trying hard, most of the time he doesn't get this option in tournaments, so you maybe don't care, but it's good to be able to cover everything, right? At least the basic understanding is helpful. I don't think all of his inputs are on yet. Now, without going into too much detail about why we have different clawbots, it mostly has to do with zoning and specific things you'd want to do one way or the other. The important thing here is that he's still not going to use the Matador Flip that often. In fact, technically this version uses it less than the one you saw last time. But, as you can now see, this one won't always use the kick afterwards. So you do have to think about what is coming, if anything. It's not the hardest move to understand how to deal with as a whole. Mostly it's either going to hit you or not. And he doesn't have a choice in whether or not he moves backward. So it does a good job of changing his rhythm somewhat. But if you happen to have the version where he doesn't actually always do the kick, there is some little bits to learn, particularly if you use the other V-trigger. We started with this one because I needed to verify that it's not going to do that much. However, with Bloody Kiss on... Oh, did not do that right. Understanding your spacing relative to him when he's constantly doing that becomes at least enough of a challenge that you have to care. Fortunately, it's not likely to be overwhelming or cause you a bunch of trouble or make the bot unbearable to fight against because it just spams it all the time. He does it about the same amount of times as you'd expect. And in fact, quite often won't be in range to even hit with the kick, just because of his general rhythm. He was also thankfully very quick about demonstrating the fact that he can just do that and will not necessarily be a problem. It's one of those things where he gets to get into position for something else he wants to do, and you have to think about, should I really be going after him right now? Because I might get kicked if I do that, but at the same time, there's a benefit if you can catch him. Most of this bot is, as mentioned, about learning just the air-to-air stuff. So, it doesn't generally get in the way of anything he's intended to do. So just enjoy him having one more move that's slightly more useful than his V skill depending on your character type. But that lets us speak about him for a very short time. Please remember that if we eventually come up with a Clawbot 2, you will find that on 2-mk.org/bots along with all of the others. We don't have any strong plans for development of other bots. More so, I guess our top priority would be Juri Bot 2. But he can possibly get in there. So now to our final bot of the evening.
Guile. Come on.
Bearing in mind again that our Guile bot 1 doesn't really benefit from this. And he doesn't even really use his meters for much. We were supposed to specifically make modifications to this bot based on things in Arcade Edition. Nothing in Arcade Edition made us do them. We may still make modifications based on this for this version. Because Champion Edition, we might be able to convert Guilebot 2 into something a little more fancy. Should be auto recover, I think. We're going to leave the critical gauge at normal for now, though. So, this is about air-to-airs and anti-airs. And if there's some V reversals to get past certain things. Depending on the inputs, he will also be able to do his Sonic Blade, which is the D point. Basically, you need to get past his V skill. But that was the rarest point on this version of the bot. So it was also not the most important one. And even in the extreme version, you still had the options to get points from B and C. It was just a matter of your meters that changed that much. So your idea was anything Guile did, sorry, anything your character could do to get past his Sonic Blade, his V skill 1, was valid. So just do that. This bot is primarily about anti-airs and 3-frame punishes, which is why he's in the advanced section. He does tend to respace himself so he can jump at you as well. And Guile has that he has one of the strongest zoning jump kicks in the game. Even Bison and Cody just have long ones. Guile's is just mean. Because it's ambiguous and then he can air throw and just no. Depending on your player type, we change the amount of walk back he has within the jump animation. As you can see, this is Justvine's account, and Justvine shares some training tools with Counter Dynasty, which means that they would have the longer walk back because of their general way of playing. Bison and Mika get into more trouble when Guile walks back further. Cammy not so much, but Karine also does, mostly because she ends up standing there. This was more effective when he had Sonic Blade, but Dive Sonic is not really that much different. Can you react to Dive Sonic? It's important to actually be able to. At high levels, it is a risk your opponent is taking. If you just let Guile use this move for free, eventually he will find a way to use it to make you miserable. Even if it's not the greatest of moves, Daigo, for example, finds it worthy of complaining about, although we're not sure how serious he was. It fits well into Guilebot 2.0's flow because he doesn't use it that often. And while we can definitely imagine having to face a lot of Guiles in the mid-levels who do, a lot of the mid-level Guile like to zone and like to run away and like to have very, very strong defense. They've been playing for long enough that I doubt a lot of people who play Guile with any seriousness are going to be picking up this V skill with the intention of using it to get in. It will more so be for counter zoning, a different form of counter zoning that lets Guile push you forward without having to lose his gaps. And since the bot is not really about learning to counter zone Guile, this is technically a better way to look at it. Guile may just want to occasionally do this move. Just to move forward without losing any charge, just to be annoying, just to remind you he has it, I don't know. But you generally want to be able to respond to it. However, there's no real test in can you respond to this move if he just spams it and you learn everything you can do. You could absolutely have him do that. In fact, you can change which things are on such that the input is there so that you're constantly seeing it. But again, that might not teach you too much. Because most of us have a good idea by now how to hit moves like that. The question is, can you react to it happening in time? And to test your reactions, it's usually better to have the bot only do the thing very, very seldom. So feel free to learn to do it first, with him doing it more often, but if you're a relatively seasoned player who maybe only used our bots for a while back to get like much higher in rank but left them in your system because, you know, they're easy enough to change around certain things if you find some new trick your opponent has. Guilebot 2 was probably not a bot you had a lot of reason to change, because Guile players don't exactly come up with new sick setups very often. Meaning that you can continue to just use this one as is, and hopefully the type of player I'm referring to already has most of their reactions, already understands how to do most of the things they want to do, and the amount that Guilebot 2.0 probably will do this move should suit their purposes just fine. If you're finding yourself facing Guiles constantly doing this move, I don't really know what to tell you or them, because again, it's not terrible, but it's not the sort of thing that leads to great success. At least not in a situation where the bot will teach you about how to deal with it. It's more so something Guile uses to deal with the expectation of someone throwing out something at him on the ground that one of his other ground avoidance style moves will not deal with. One thing that does affect this a little bit is the length of the walk back, and that's the last thing we'll cover tonight. The length of the walk back is variable not only in terms of the fact that, hey, my character, I get twitchy, or my character doesn't do as well when Guile has a lot of space between us. There's also like characters who have specific ways of responding to sonic booms. Might want to have less or more time so that they can experiment more with the spacings required. And as that input's generally fairly easy to change, it's not usually a big deal. It's also the one that puts the V skill in, so feel free to use it as you need to. Some Guilebot 2.0 inputs are generally better than others. Outside of that, you generally should not worry about this. The use of Dive Sonic is likely going to be about the same either way. With that, therefore, I believe we've covered all of the bots in question, but we will take one final look at Guilebot. Not specifically to point out anything about his skills, or even his point system, but to note one specific thing that only comes up when he is using his V-Skill 1. Our general advice when learning to fight Guile was to use Guile's V trigger 2, and it didn't matter too much which V skill you used. Let's put him someplace ridiculous. I think it's fair to say that's where he's least likely to turn up. And get arrested for walking around in his underwear in someone's backyard. Anyway, more seriously, in this case we're finally going to look at what Guilebot does when he is placed on V skill 1 and V trigger 1. This is not, again, not our recommended way of training against this character, but players who are very confident in their ability to put certain types of zoning in front of you from various options will play this, and our Guilebot is not the greatest representation of those players right now, mainly because it's extremely complex to have them do it, but it's because he needs his variants active in order for this to really work out. However, we have learned something somewhat useful in that regard. Specifically, let's look at turning off his action 3. Now, because the sort of person that does this a lot... Wait, is it 3 or 1 or 4? Oh, no, it's definitely 4. Because the sort of person that does this a lot doesn't care about the dash throw, they don't care about certain extra types of lariats. Their goal is to keep you entirely out of the space. This only works in this configuration. 1, 2, 3, and 5 are on, V skill 1, V trigger 1. And no, it's not necessarily going to make him do any better zoning as a whole, unfortunately. What we're looking for here, and I should put him on max start for both of those things. What we're looking for here is Guile's interactions between his meteor strikes and his placement in terms of moving forward. If you're not very good at stopping Guile from moving forward, eventually he'll corner you. And if Guile corners you with this particular set of options up, things actually start to get a little dangerous. Now, this is a little ironic because the sort of player who does this is not the sort of player who normally corners you. However, they are the sort of player who gets cornered and then gets out, leaving you to deal with the consequences of that. If you don't move forward yourself against Guile very much, however, he does tend to corner you. So if you find yourself to be the sort of person who wants to zone yourself or doesn't deal that well with this, you may want to try this config until you have time to put in all the variants that would make him somewhat stronger for his purposes. Because of the fact he actually can control the spacing on the Comet, but we don't have enough inputs to put on all of the spacings he could use, obviously he'll tend to put them in the same place. I really need to figure out if that moves a projectile or not, so I keep on trying to go through it.
You must accept your fate.
You can see easily here how he can at least manage to corner people. And once he does corner you, he has fairly good corner guard. With his action 4 on, he generally won't use those options. The rhythm will somehow mess him up and he'll end up throwing out cryokinesis, which is good if you expect to need to learn to deal with it. But honestly, you can learn a lot of this matchup without the cryokinesis active. Especially if you are good at counter zoning already. And since it takes away very little of anything else he's trying to do, including his ability to whiff punish with his super. There's not too much loss. So definitely spend your time getting used to this option that Guile has. And we'll work on how to optimize his ability to use the skill in ways that fill up more space for the type of zoning used here. But if you're the type that backs off a lot, it's not likely to be a problem regardless. Nope. That move just has too much range for that to work. And that, therefore, brings us to the end of our stream for tonight. That covers all of our bots. You can find them all at 2-mk.org. And you can find any information about updates to them, i.e. re-releases or major updates to their infrastructure, when we tweet from 2_mk_FGC. Next week we'll be returning to normal streaming. We technically were on normal streaming most of this week, but a bit more quiet. So, Mishmashing Battle Lounge on Monday. The Tuesday train, either Guilty Gear or Unist on Tuesday. Probably nothing on Wednesday, depending on if we have bot work to do. But we may be getting more sandbag casuals this time of year. And Kame House on Thursday. Although Kame House is kind of dependent on whether or not we're traveling for tournaments. As is the Friday content, which is often this guidance just like this, or Dead or Alive, or both, because we do have some Dead or Alive bots now. Overall, therefore, we hope you have had success with our bots and can give us any information you need to about changes you've seen in them based on trying out these V-triggers from our contact page at 2-mk.org. And therefore we wish you good training for the weekend. Hopefully you make as much progress as you wish. This has been Rillian, 142MK, along with Kanzuki Dynasty. Thank you for watching, and good night everyone.